Joseph Jacob Foss was born on April 17, 1915, on a windswept farm just north of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where the tall prairie grass met a horizon wide enough to stir any young dreamer's imagination. His father, a hard-working tenant farmer of Norwegian stock, taught Joe the value of perseverance. His mother balanced the toil of farm life with gentle wisdom and a deep Lutheran faith. When Joe was 12, the family drove 50 miles to see Charles Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis circle the Sioux Falls airfield on the victory tour that followed Lindbergh's Atlantic crossing. Standing on a wooden crate to peer over the crowd, Joe watched the silver monoplane skim across the sky, sunlight flashing on its wings. In that moment, the prairie boy who had known only dirt roads and wheat fields felt destiny tug him upward. The Great Depression soon battered South Dakota. In 1933, a pickup loaded with produce skidded on loose gravel and flipped into a ditch. Joe's father was pinned beneath and died before help arrived. At 18, Joe became head of the household, responsible for his widowed mother, younger siblings, and a farm weighted by debt. He kept the farm running by day and attended Sioux Falls College by night, pedaling miles in the dark with a book bag slung across his shoulders. Every spare minute he studied aviation magazines in the school library, tracing cockpit diagrams with a calloused finger. With $5 saved from trapping muskrats along the Big Sioux River, he paid for a 15-minute barnstormer ride. The instructor let him grasp the stick, and the trembling sensation of flight, half terror and half exultation, sealed his ambition. In 1939, after 3 grinding years, Joe had saved enough for part-time tuition at the University of South Dakota. He joined the newly formed South Dakota National Guard Aero Unit, scraping together $85 for 10 hours of civilian flight instruction. On a frigid December morning, he soloed a battered Taylorcraft through gusts that rattled the windows of farmhouses below. Clouds of frost drifted off his leather jacket when he landed, but his grin warmed every mechanic on the line. That same week, Europe plunged into war. Joe sensed that the United States, though still neutral, would need fighters as surely as South Dakota needed rain. Eager to serve, he wrote to the Marine Corps, whose recruiters promised a chance to fly the fleet's newest fighters. His academic record was good, his eyesight perfect, and his character references impeccable. Yet at 25, he was already older than most cadets, and in the stiff collar-and-tie photograph he sent to Pensacola, he looked even more seasoned. The Marines accepted him on probation. In the summer of 1940, he boarded a train for Florida with a cardboard suitcase and a second-hand slide rule. At Naval Air Station Pensacola, he drilled endlessly. Navigation by stars, gunnery by deflection sights, instrument recoveries blindfolded under a canvas hood. Younger cadets collapsed into bunks after lectures. Joe reviewed notes, his lamp burning. After midnight, he graduated near the top of Class 134 and received the gold wings of a naval aviator on March 30, 1941. For months, he ferried F-4F Wildcats from East Coast factories to West Coast bases, tracking the curve of the continent by railroad. Lights blinking in the night. Then came December 7, 1941, and everything changed. Assigned to Marine Fighter Squadron 121, he sailed across the Pacific aboard the USS Coppahee, arriving at Guadalcanal's Henderson Field in mid-October 1942. The island smelled of coral dust and diesel. Palm fronds shivered in the prop blast of Wildcats rising to meet incoming raids. The Japanese called the airstrip the Cactus Patch, but to Joe and his fellow pilots, it became the thin, vital line between the Marines dug in along the Lunga perimeter and the naval task forces clashing at Iron Bottom Sound. Joe Foss entered combat on October 13th, the night a pair of Japanese battleships pummeled Henderson with 8-inch shells. Shrapnel shredded revetments and flares lit the coconut, palms like torches. At dawn, Joe's section scrambled through smoke still drifting from the runway. Over the slot, a stretch of water between Guadalcanal and the Florida Islands, the Wildcats fell upon a gaggle of Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers escorted by nimble A6M Zeros. Joe pressed the trigger and felt the synchronized hammer of 650 caliber Brownings. A Betty's port engine exploded, sending the bomber cartwheeling into the sea. It was his first kill. Over the next 15 weeks, he became the scourge of Japanese aviators. On October 18th, he led 8 Wildcats against a swarm of 22 Zeros, diving from cloud cover to scatter the formation. He personally downed 3. A week later, he achieved ace in a day, splashing 5 aircraft in 2 sorties on October 25th. The streak continued through November, even as malnutrition, dengue, fever and sleepless nights gnawed at the squadron. Joe's men, dubbed Foss's Flying Circus, chalked victory silhouettes on a mess tent board. Each silhouette lifted morale like a hymn. By January 1943, Joe's tally reached 26 confirmed victories, tying the World War I record, set by Eddie Rickenbacker and making Foss the first American ace of aces of the new war. Yet glory wore a price. Tropical malaria racked his body with fevers so high he hallucinated tracer fire dancing across the thatch roof of the infirmary. For 2 weeks he lay on a cot, alternating chills with sweats that soaked the mattress. When he returned to duty, he found himself hesitant to pull the trigger, haunted by the sight of a Zero pilot tumbling from his cockpit on fire. He forced the image aside, telling himself that hesitation in combat cost Marines on the ground their lives. On January 15th, he flew his final Guadalcanal patrol, escorting SBD Dauntless dive bombers against retreating Japanese transports. Over the radio, he heard a young wingman shout, "He's on my tail!" Joe rolled his Wildcat inverted, dove beneath the bombers, and blasted the pursuing Zero off the newcomer's 6. The squadron landed just before sunset. Joe climbed from the cockpit, handed his pistol belt to a crew chief, and lost consciousness beside the wheel. Malaria had returned, and the doctors ordered him stateside. In March 1943, Joe Foss stepped onto the tarmac at Washington National Airport, lean as a fence rail and bemused by flashes from assembled news cameras. Life magazine splashed his face on the June 7th cover. War bond rallies beckoned. On May 18th, he stood in the East Room of the White House, where President Franklin D. Roosevelt draped the Medal of Honor around his neck. Joe felt the heavy, 5-pointed star settle against his dress blues and thought of the tri-line eyes of the farm boy counting pennies back in South Dakota. He spoke softly of pilots who never came home, refusing to let adulation eclipse their memory. The Bond tour carried him coast to coast, selling Liberty bonds beside Hollywood actresses and football heroes. He felt awkward under theater spotlights, yet he spoke plainly, and audiences trusted him. In late 1944, he returned to combat duty as the executive officer of Marine Fighting Squadron 115 aboard the USS Essex, now flying the sleek new F-4U Corsair over the Philippines. He scored his final aerial victory on December 14, 1944, exploiting the Corsair's diving speed to claim a Nakajima Ki-44 Tojo. When Japan capitulated, his war total remained at 26 enemy aircraft destroyed. Demobilized in 1946, he returned to Sioux Falls and helped organize the South Dakota Air National Guard, rising to brigadier general. But public life beckoned again. A persuasive Republican recruiter suggested that the hero of Guadalcanal might also serve as a voice for veterans in the legislature. In 1948, Joe won a seat in the South Dakota House of Representatives. 7 years later, on a frigid January morning in Pierre, he raised his hand to become the state's 20th governor. He was 39, the youngest chief executive in South Dakota's history, and campaigned on better roads, rural electrification, and hunting rights for returning servicemen. National politics soon lured him, yet he preferred action to committee rooms. When Lamar Hunt and fellow businessmen launched the American Football League in 1959, they asked Joe Foss to become the league's first commissioner. He accepted, seeing a chance to build something from the ground up, just as he had once graded red clay into airstrips on Pacific Islands. He spent 3 restless seasons juggling team owners' egos, negotiating television contracts, and persuading established National Football League executives that competition could elevate the sport. Though he eventually resigned over revenue disputes, many credited him with giving the upstart league the legitimacy it needed to survive long enough for eventual merger. Television came next. In 1964, he hosted The Outdoorsman Joe Foss, a syndicated show that chronicled wildlife conservation, marksmanship, and ethical hunting. Viewers admired his unvarnished passion for the land and the sense of stewardship he traced back to prairie roots. He later served as president of the National Rifle Association from 1988 to 1990, advocating firearm safety programs for youth. Even detractors conceded that his earnestness bridged partisan divides. Throughout all the public acclaim, Joe remained anchored by family. He had married June Shackstad, a South Dakota schoolteacher, during a brief 1942 stateside leave between combat tours. She weathered campaigns, and bond tours with unwavering poise. They adopted 2 children, Terry and Joe Jr., and built a modest ranch outside Sioux Falls, where Joe could retreat to saddle a horse or cast a fly into the Big Sioux. He spoke little about nightmares that sometimes woke him drenched in sweat, Zeros roaring out of blackness, or wildcats aflame over Iron Bottom Sound, but June would find him seated by the window, staring at moonlit grazing land until dawn. In 1998, at age 83, he returned to Guadalcanal for a memorial ceremony marking the campaign's 56th anniversary. Leaning on a cane, he walked the overgrown remnants of Henderson Field. Nightjars swooped over trenches now half consumed by jungle vines. In a clearing near the abandoned control tower, he paused, eyes moist, fingertips brushing the rough coral soil. A young Marine corporal accompanying the delegation asked what he was thinking. Joe answered simply, "I'm thanking the fellas who gave me the chance to grow old." Joseph Foss died on January 1, 2003, in Scottsdale, Arizona, after suffering a stroke. At Arlington National Cemetery, a light snowfall softened the notes of taps as mourners gathered among rows of white marble. Some remembered the governor, others the football executive, the television host, the NRA president. Yet for many, he would always be Captain Foss of VMF 121, the lanky Wildcat pilot who emerged from the smoke of Henderson Field with 26 Rising Sun flags on his fuselage and the grit to hold the line when the Pacific War's outcome still hung in the balance. His legacy endures in more than medals or political offices. It lives in every aviator who scans the sky with disciplined courage, in every public servant who prizes humility over headlines, and in every boy or girl who stares up from a lonely field and dares to dream of flight. That perhaps is the truest measure of the first air hero of Guadalcanal, a life that lifted others as surely as a wildcat lifting from the coral runway into dawn, climbing toward the distant roar of promise. Even after the graveside bugle at Arlington fell silent, Joe's story kept gathering chapters written by the very people he had inspired. Months before his death, he had joined friends and educators in launching the Joseph Foss Institute, a non-profit devoted to teaching American civics through the lens of living veterans. Classrooms that once introduced World War II only through Blurry textbook photos now welcomed guest speakers who had felt the heat of an aircraft engine or the churn of a landing craft ramp. The Institute's traveling trunk included a leather flight helmet like the one Joe wore in his Wildcat, its sweat-stained browband carrying a human reality no printed paragraph could match. Students handled the relic, asked why a South Dakotan, traveled halfway around the world to fight, and discovered that duty and sacrifice were not abstractions, but a pact binding generations. In Sioux Falls, the regional airport, where that long-ago Lindbergh tour had ignited a boy's dream, was renamed Joe Foss Field. Each summer, commercial passengers stepping off regional jets crossed a concourse mural that showed a grinning captain in a parachute harness, palm trees bending behind him. The city placed a restored F-86 Sabre at the entrance, its silver skin gleaming under prairie sunlight. On dedication day, elderly farmers who had once wagered 5 cents that Joe would never come home from Guadalcanal stood blinking at the jet and remembering the farm kid who baled hay alongside them after dawn milking. Their grandchildren climbed the wing roots and learned that greatness might grow from any patch of wind-swept ground. Joe's papers, mission notes scrawled in pencil, clippings annotated in his tight cursive, went to the University of South Dakota. Archivists' unfolding map overlays could still smell the faint tang of South Pacific mildew. Scholars traced how his combat reports evolved. Early entries were clipped and clinical, but as weeks passed, the handwriting slanted harder, sentences lengthened, and tiny ticks marked every wildcat lost. One historian argued that those margins, crowded with "Damn it, we miss Hank," and "Tell O'Neill's mom he saved my life today," revealed more about leadership than any manual. When the curator called to ask if family members minded public display of such private grief, Joe's daughter answered that her father had always believed truth, however raw, was the surest tribute to fallen friends. On the West Coast, the Flying Leatherneck Aviation Museum in Miramar unveiled Wildcat Bureau number 522437, repainted in VMF 121 markings with 26 rising sun flags beneath the canopy rail. Veterans shuffled forward, tracing chipped rivets as if reading Braille. A former Navy corpsman, 85 and cane-shaking, confessed he had once pumped quinine into Joe's arm during a fever so fierce the pilot tried to climb an imaginary ladder to his aircraft. "I told him, 'Sir, you're in sick bay, not the cockpit,'" the old medic laughed, wiping his eyes. The exhibit docents added that story to the official tour because it showed an ace's endurance depending on unseen hands. Meanwhile, pilots at Marine Corps Air Station Yuma began vying for slots in an annual Foss Cup gunnery competition. The trophy was a miniature bronze Wildcat, banking through an invisible burst of tracers. Winners received no prize money, only a handshake from a grey-haired colonel who had once flown F-4 Phantoms under Joe's command. But they practiced for months because accuracy, discipline, and calm under pressure were the virtues Joe had, drilled into every squadron he led. One Harrier pilot later wrote that polishing the cup before its presentation made him feel linked to a lineage stretching from canvas-covered biplanes to supersonic jets. Popular media kept rediscovering the quiet hero. A 2008 documentary, Wings of Valor, used newly declassified gun camera footage to match Joe's after-action reports shot by shot. Viewers watched tracers rake a meatball-marked bomber, then heard Joe's taped interview from the 1990s. "I wasn't counting victories, just engines silenced so they couldn't bomb our boys." The juxtaposition of crackling 16mm film and a grandfatherly voice challenged the romance of air combat with the sober arithmetic of protection. June, Joe's steadfast partner through 6 decades, died in 2015. At her memorial service, the pastor read from letters Joe had mailed during stateside hospital stays. One page, dated February 12, 1943, confessed that malaria made his handwriting wobble, but not his conviction that God brings us home by airways unknown. Their ashes were later interred together near the Big Sioux River under the shade of cottonwoods that had overseen Joe's first trapline. Fishermen wading for walleye often paused to read the plaque and realize the shallow river once mirrored the sky for a man who saw both as runways. Across the ocean, the Solomon Islands government invited surviving relatives to mark the 80-year anniversary of the Guadalcanal landings. Islanders whose grandparents had guided wounded aviators through swampy banyan groves wove pandanus leaf garlands and draped them over American shoulders. A village elder recalled how, after a dogfight, Joe circled low and dropped a note describing the location of a downed Marine pilot. Islanders paddled dugout canoes through midnight surf to rescue him. The original note, sweat-blurred yet readable, now hangs in Honiara's museum, proof that courage without compassion was never Joe's creed. Inside the Joseph Foss Institute offices in Phoenix, visitors can slip on virtual reality goggles and sit in a wildcat cockpit as flak bursts bloom above Iron-Bottom Sound. The program pauses at critical decisions, whether to break left and expose one's wingman or dive through a formation despite empty ammo belts, and students must choose. Their heart rates, logged by fingertip sensors, spike much as Joe's had during 14-hour days when hunger, fever, and enemy fighters converged. Educators don't grade for right or wrong. They debrief, asking how responsibility feels when every option carries risk. Joe would have liked that. He believed valor was not a gilded noun, but a verb conjugated in moments of fearful clarity. The echoes of that belief reach beyond classrooms. A South Dakota scholarship bearing his name stipulates that applicants must log 50 hours of community service. One recent recipient taught newly arrived refugees how to navigate state driver license exams. Another built model rockets with underprivileged middle schoolers, explaining how the throttle quadrant in a Wildcat differed from thrust vectoring in a space capsule. Both began essays by admitting they had never heard of Joseph Foss until the scholarship prompt. By the final paragraph, they addressed him directly, thanking him for proving that a farm kid could read the sky and reshape the earth beneath it. When modern Marine aviators kneel before a fresh-painted squadron crest and recite the names of legacy aces, Joseph Jacob Foss now stands among them like a compass point. Not merely the first American to match Eddie Rickenbacker's total, but a leader who saw each victory as an act of shielding brothers below. A public servant who swapped dogfights for legislative debates without losing aim. A mentor whose quiet integrity steadied generations long after his prop arc stilled. His Wildcat's metal has corroded, the coral runway is overgrown, yet the lift he generated endures in civic programs, in airfields humming with life, and in every solitary student who glances from textbook margins to the open sky and hears on the prairie wind an invitation to climb.